after you have an ILS approach figured out, flying a localizer-only approach would be a snap. Well, it's really not all that tough, but without the help of a glide slope, keeping track of your descent does become a little more complicated. But just as on an ILS approach, a good self-briefing in advance will make everything go a whole lot easier. So let's brief ourselves for this approach. I'm inbound from Bartlesville Vortac for the approach to Independence, Kansas. And I found out by checking the NOTAMs that the glide slope for the ILS runway 35 approach is out of service. Even so, I've asked Kansas City Center for the ILS runway 35 approach. They'll treat it as an ILS approach with a component missing, and I'll use the ILS approach chart. As before, we'll use an NOS chart, but regardless of which type of chart you use, the principle is the same. You want to familiarize yourself with the information that you need to be able to fly it safely. Now, since you've flown an ILS approach before to Independence with John, a lot of this information will be familiar. But it's always a good idea to review it just before you start the approach. As always, I'll start with the airport name to make sure I've got the right approach chart out. We're flying into Independence Municipal Airport in Independence, Kansas. Next, we'll verify it's the right approach. It's the ILS approach for runway 35. Once again, on the upper left are the communications frequencies. By the way, this symbol with a reverse type L next to a frequency tells you they have pilot-controlled lighting, and it's next to the frequency you'd use to control the lights, in this case 122.7. The star tells you that the way you control the lights is non-standard, and you'd have to look it up in the airport facility directory. Well, you know, I did just that during my pre-flight planning, and I couldn't find any mention of non-standard control of the lighting. So I phoned the airport at Independence, which, by the way, isn't a bad idea, even if you don't have a specific question. It turned out the folks in airport operations didn't have any idea what could be considered non-standard about their system. They assured me that everything would respond to my microphone clicks just as I would normally expect it to. Next, I'll remind myself of the navigation frequencies. This 041 radial is off of Bartlesville Vortac. The frequency of Bartlesville is 117.9er. The military channel number tells me that Bartlesville has DME. The localizer frequency is 110.7, and its identifier is IDP. The locator outer marker is Jeffy. The frequency of it is 335, and its identifier is ID. And as always, let's check out the minimum sector altitudes. The minimum safe altitude for all directions is 2,700 feet MSL. Next, let's look at the approach course from the plan view. There are two fixes on final. As you remember, there's a step-down fix at EDVA, which is defined by the Bartlesville 041 radial. Since I expect to be radar vectored to final, I probably won't have to do the course reversal shown by the holding pattern at EDVA. The final approach course is 355 degrees, and you can identify the locator outer marker by the NDB Jeffy as well as the marker beacon. For a localizer-only approach, I'll have to make especially sure that I start my time at Jeffy. Now I'll look at the approach again, this time from the profile view. The altitude is 3,000 feet to EDVA. After EDVA, I can descend at 2,500 feet. The lightning bolt symbol tells me 2,500 feet is the altitude for glide slope interception. But since the glide slope is not working, I'll have to maintain 2,500 feet until I get to Jeffy. When I get to Jeffy, I'll start the time and begin my descent to the minimum descent altitude of 1,220 feet. That's 399 feet above the touchdown zone. I'll use 90 knots, and the missed approach point will be 3 minutes and 20 seconds from the locator outer marker. I'll use my non-precision approach descent rate of 800 feet per minute. I need to descend a little less than 1,300 feet to get down to my minimum descent altitude. That will give me plenty of time to level off and get stabilized before I start looking for the runway and focusing on my time to missed approach. Now, the missed approach instructions are the same as for the ILS. I'll climb straight ahead until I get to 1,500 feet. Then I'll make a climbing left turn to 3,000 feet on a heading of 135 degrees. And I'll hold that heading until I intercept the Independence localizer, and then I'll head south to Edgware intersection. I'll just memorize the initial climb instructions. In this case, it says to climb straight ahead until I get to 1,500 feet. Now I'll check out the airport diagram to remind myself of the lights I can expect. The A5 tells me that runway 35 has a medium intensity approach light system with runway alignment indicator lights. The dot on top of the circle tells me the system has sequence flashers. And as we've discussed, the fact that the symbol has black with reverse print tells me the lighting is pilot controlled. Runway 35 itself has REIL, Runway End Identification Lights. That's the flashing strobes on either side of the runway threshold. And it has MIRL, Medium Intensity Runway Edge Lights. And remember, you can always use the legend for all of this at the front of the approach plate book. Finally, I'll scan the chart for any special notes. This note says, use Coffeyville altimeter setting. And as you remember, the NA in this note means I cannot file Independence as an alternate on an IFR flight plan. The most important things to remember from this self-briefing are, first of all, how low can I go? My minimum descent altitude is 1,220 feet. How far can I go? I can go until 3 minutes and 20 seconds from Jeffy. And finally, which way do I go on missed approach? In this case, I climb straight ahead to 1,500 feet. Now, I've briefed the approach, and things will be easier because of it. But as you know, I'm not going to be able to memorize all this information. So I'll make sure I've got things organized so I can look at the chart easily as I fly the approach.
Cessna Niner Echo Sierra, turn right heading 060, vectors to final.
Cessna Niner Echo Sierra, turn right heading 060, slowing to approach speed.
Roger, Niner Echo Sierra.
Now the controller told me that this was a vector to final. That means I'm getting close and I'd better slow down. I advised the controller I was doing this when I acknowledged my turn vector. That way he knows that my little blob on his radar screen won't be moving quite as briskly. So now I'll slow down to 90 knots and select approach flaps of 10 degrees. Notice that the controller is giving me the same kind of vectors I'd receive if I were flying an ILS. That's because, as far as the controller is concerned, I'm flying the same kind of approach and occupying the same chunk of his airspace. I just have a component missing, the glide slope. This changes the way I do my descent, my minimums, and the way I determine my missed approach point. Well, since the controller is now handling the navigation chores, this is a good time to get set up for the approach. First, I'll make sure that the #1 navigation indicator is set to the #1 nav radio and not to the GPS. Next, I'll set in the approach course of 355 in the OBS. As you remember, this doesn't make any difference at all in the way the needle reads, but it does help remind me of the direction of the final approach course. Now I'll tune the localizer and identify it. Next, I'll set the Bartlesville frequency in my number 2 radio and identify it. And then I'll set my number 2 indicator, the OBS, to 041. I'll set the outer compass locator frequency of 335 in the ADF and identify it. And I'll get my timer all set up so I can capture the time at Jeffy. Next, I'll make sure my marker beacon audio is turned on, test it, and set the sensitivity. Finally, I like to use the audio panel as a checklist to make sure I've thought of everything. Looks good. Now I'll do the before landing checklist. Pilot and passenger seat backs, most upright position. Okay. Seats and seat belts secured and locked. Fuel selector valve, it is on both. Mixture is rich. Landing and taxi lights, I'll turn them on. And the autopilot is off. Before landing checklist complete. And now we're all set up and ready for the approach.